grouse. Here we go. Which is one of the forest grouse that we'll be talking about today. When I started that program, I had seen one rough grouse in my entire life. And that was in Kentucky. It was purely by chance. And that led to a doctoral dissertation studying what was then the blue grouse. And that has since been divided into two species, the dusky and the sooty grouse. Those are two of the other of the four species of forest grouse in North America that you're going to learn about today. So I professionally, I describe my focus, my research focus and expertise and background in a variety of ways, such as game bird ecology, forest bird habitat ecologist, upland game bird ecologist, but a lot of it, my focus has been on game birds. And here in Tennessee, that in the United States, that's primarily quail, grouse, and turkeys, and then a few other species that are not native, plus one little one down in the southern tip of Texas, which is what we're going to start with today. Anybody ever heard of a chachalaca? Plain chachalaca down in South Texas. So today's species accounts the forest grouse. You have the Upland Game Birds of North America sheet to review, and you have the page in Canvas that tells you what you're responsible for, which is all the higher taxa, none of the scientific names, but all the common names. So it'll be the families, subfamilies, common names, in the order. If you want to learn the scientific names of the northern bobwhite, the rough grouse, and the wild turkey, you would probably feel very enriched doing so. It's only 3 scientific names, and those are Tennessee. I'm getting a room full of people looking at me like I'm an alien. Okay, I'll move on. All right. So this is the plain chachalaca from South Texas. Lives in shrubby habitats on down through Mexico, just south of Texas, just South Texas. It's a polygamous species. Some of our upland game birds are monogamous, some are polygamous. It is a polygamous species with small clutch sizes. It lives in kind of a shrubby, mesquite chaparral type habitat, and it forages in trees for fruits, for soft mast and trees. It is a game species, but since it only occurs in just a very small part of southern Texas, most people in America haven't heard of it. Who's heard of the plain chachalaca before? Come on, just say it. It's fun to say. Say it out loud. Let's go ahead and say it.
Chachalaca.
Doesn't that sound good? Doesn't that feel good to say? It's a fun word.
Sure.
Okay. All right. Excellent. I should back up and say that when we talk about upland game birds, that, depending on who you talk to, that can include wider groups of birds, such as migratory species like mourning doves. And as long as you're talking about mourning doves, some people will put woodcock, American woodcock in there. Now that's kind of a weird one because woodcock is a shorebird, and it lives in the winter in moist forest openings, right, where it's probing in kind of swampy forest soil for worms. But it breeds up in the north in aspen popple, young regenerating aspen stands, which is upland. So that therefore sometimes they're considered grouped with upland game birds. But mostly when we talk about upland game birds, we're talking about non-migratory species, usually in the galliform, of the order Galliformes. And Galliformes comes from gallo, which means chicken, so chicken-like birds. And I always get a little bit of attitude about that because the grouse and quails and turkeys came before chickens, so they should call them grousiforms, but nobody listens to me, so we'll just look at it. All right, let's get right to the quail, okay? So we have 6 species of quail in North America, and one of them is in eastern North America, and that's the northern bobwhite. So the reason, everybody calls it quail, and I get it, 'cause it's the only quail here anywhere near us. But if you're talking in a broader context to anybody else, then you shouldn't use the term quail, because it could be any one of these species, and several others in other places. Whereas a lot of the grouse are more northern species, a lot of the quail tend to be more southern species, okay? So this is the first one, the California quail, which has a range, as you might imagine, down along coastal California. Notice a couple things, okay, because I'm going to show you another species that looks very similar. Does anybody know what that other species is?
Gambles.
The Gamble's quail. So it has this top knot, that leans forward, right? Has a chocolate top, a superorbital stripe, has a white bib, and a black throat. And notice this this gray breast, and then you have the scaling below that gray breast. The Gamble's quail is going to have something different, okay? Now the California quail, when you get up far enough north, like up into Oregon State or Oregon and maybe Washington, it intermixes with a quail species called the mountain quail. So up there, a lot of locals call this one the valley quail, because this one tends to be down lower elevations, the mountain quail at higher elevations. California quail is the formal common name. Some folks call it the valley quail. So it's got that coastal distribution all the way up into British Columbia, Washington State, Eastern Washington, Eastern Oregon, Eastern California, all the way down through Baja California. So very, it ranges pretty far north, but way far south, and a little bit down there in South America as well. So this is a medium and average size quail, 9 to 11 inches. The quail tend to be monogamous, okay? Usually they form annual pair bonds. Average clutch size for a quail is a dozen or more eggs. And they live in a type of habitat that is called chaparral. As a biome, you might have heard of the term Mediterranean scrub shrub biome. It's also called chaparral. It's a little too dry to grow lush forests. So it's kind of a semi-arid habitat that does get enough precipitation to grow shrubs, but it's better than desert and such. So that's the California quail. And that's the Gamble's quail that looks very similar. Yeah?
Is their cubby structure differ from bobwhite's?
Good question. And in my experience, I never saw large coveys of any of these species like I saw in bobwhites. Bobwhites have seen the largest coveys that I've seen, but I'll tell you the truth, I do not know if I was just always seeing small coveys of all these species or not.
We drive through some of the sections of the ranch and it was like cockroaches that were just everywhere.
Everywhere.
So I didn't know if it was just
Okay.
they were young ones that were all, I don't know how they.
What time of year was it?
Something over the summer.
Yeah, yes, probably a lot of, you're flushing up broods, I would imagine.
Yeah, because like some sections it wasn't uncommon to see like 20 jump up at a time and
Cool.
scatter off.
Cool, okay, all right. And was what you were seeing Gamble's quail?
They said they were California.
California's really, okay, all right, that's pretty far east.
But you said they were, the size you gave was a lot bigger than what we were seeing, so unless it, like you said, unless it was broods that were just scattered.
I would imagine broods, yeah. So this is a Gamble's quail, and you notice it looks very similar. It has that forward-facing top knot, the chocolate top, the superorbital stripe, the chin bib, and the black throat. Also has the gray, but instead of grading into scales, you get this buffy patch with a kind of chocolate-covered center. And that's the difference. That's how you tell them apart. Range-wise, the California quail is more coastal. The Gamble quail is a little bit more interior. Okay, so let's see. There you go. There's the Gambles, and there's the California. Okay, that's the diagnostic difference. Got it? Good. Okay. There's others, but that's different. The Gamble's quail is interior California, Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico, and not Baja California, but coastal Mexico on the inside there, and it doesn't go as far north. Okay. Similar size, maybe a little bigger, monogamous, similar clutch size. This is more of a desert species, whereas the California quail is more shrubby, chaparral. These guys are more in the arid desert. They're eating seeds, cactus fruits, insects. A lot of quail are a pretty arid dwelling species. This is the scaled quail, another interior species, grassland species. It has a couple other names. That white top notch gives it the nickname cotton top. When it catches the light right, it has a little bit of a blue iridescence to it, so some people call it a blue quail. But the scaled quail is the proper common name. It occurs, again, interior. Its range can overlap the Gambel's quail a little bit, but it comes a little bit further east, again, and on down into Mexico, and even to the Texas and the west edge of the Gulf of Mexico. So a little bit bigger quail, 10 to 14 inches in size. They are also monogamous, similar clutch size, about a dozen or so eggs. And these guys, desert, grassland, shrubland, a little bit of all those habitats, okay? So the California is shrubland, the Gambel's is desert. This one can kind of integrate across all of those pretty far south. They eat a variety of foods, seeds, leaves, insects. Their numbers have kind of been in decline in recent decades, so there's not just scads of them. And that brings us to our little guy, the northern bobwhite, Colinus virginianus. How many females in this photograph? One, that's right. So the male has a white eye stripe and a white throat. The female has a buffy brown eye stripe and throat. And that's how to tell them apart. So the northern bobwhite occurs across the eastern United States. Like the other quail, they tend to be more southern species. It has been introduced into eastern Oregon and southeastern California. It's crossed the Hells Canyon into Idaho a little bit, but we even see it on down into the southern Mexico, even Cuba, so several other countries as well. Average size quail, about 10 inches, seasonal pair bonds. Northern bobwhite, when conditions are really, really good, they like very interspersed habitat, so shrubby and early successional and forest edges, so a combination of all those. When conditions are really good, a male-female pair bond will work together to create a nest. The female will lay the eggs. The male will incubate those eggs. The female will go create another nest, lay another clutch of eggs, and incubate that one. That's when conditions are really, really good. It doesn't happen often, but they can be very R-selected when conditions are good. They also have been in decline, as you know. They're one of our real frustrating stories. We talk about the success stories of white-tailed deer, and wild turkey, and wood ducks, but this is one that we've really, really struggled with. Part of the reason is because their numbers were so high during the early years of our profession, I think 1930s and 40s, because farming practices were just created optimal habitat for northern bobwhite. So their numbers during the early 1900s were probably a lot higher than they were pre-settlement years. So we just had phenomenally high numbers, and then they went down as our agriculture became much more efficient and clean, and we've struggled with it ever since. We spent years, trying to examine effects of predation. Let's kill our predators, and we know now that if you give them good habitat, yeah, predators are going to be there, but they'll withstand predation if they have good habitat. So we created the Northern Bobwhite, now called the National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative, which is a blueprint for all of our states to put quail habitat back on the ground. And where we're doing that, we're growing quail. I was just talking to Brandon Gilbert. Tennessee has 4 focal areas from that Northern National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative for putting quail habitat on the ground to see if it works. The one in West Tennessee is at Wolf River Wildlife Management Area. Our graduate, Brandon Gilbert is the manager there. I was talking to him Saturday. I think he said they've got 15 or 16 coveys on the ground at Wolf River. So we know how to grow quail now. The problem is that since this is a very R-selected species that has tremendous metapopulation dynamics, when you heavily fragment the habitat, and there's no way for, you might, any given spring, you might lose half your coveys, they'll be repopulated by the remaining cubbies, but when you fragment the habitat, those remaining cubbies can't repopulate because there's inhospitable ground between your good patches. So what you need is not, I have 5 acres of fantastic quail habitat on my property, but what I need is 5,000 acres. Even if I had a couple thousand acres, I could grow quail. But what we're striving for is thousands of acres where maybe half of that habitat is good quail habitat, and that's hard to do when you mostly have private property, right? So you work with landowners using CRP and stuff. There is a subspecies of northern bobwhite called the masked bobwhite or masked quail. That's a subspecies. Not too much care. This is one. Has anybody seen this quail before? This is a funky looking little guy called the Montezuma quail. It's got a couple of other names. The Mearns quail. Well, I'm blanking on one of the names. It's another one of the western quail species. It's pretty unmistakable, but it lives in the deep south again, largely Texas, but it comes up a little bit into southern Arizona, New Mexico, and just a couple little fragments in Texas. So a little bit on the small side. They're monogamous like others. Their clutch sizes can be a dozen. They can be pretty small clutch sizes. They get into some from shrubby habitat into some kind of shrubby oak habitat and oak pine habitat. They eat bulbs and tubers and insects. That's the other name is harlequin quail. Sorry about that. Its common term is harlequin quail. In Texas, I've heard it called the cygnet quail. And then this is the 6th of the quail. We're going to go back out to the Pacific coast again, up to the Pacific Northwest, and this is the mountain quail. Like I said, the California quail is sometimes called the valley quail. The California and the Gambles had that forward-pointing top notch. This top notch is often straight up, okay? In this picture it's back, but it's often straight up. And that top notch is kind of diagnostic. It doesn't lean forward. It's pretty straight. And you don't have that super orbital stripe in your chins. It's chocolate, pretty straightforward and easy to tell. So you get back out to the coastal regions of the Coast Mountains, the Cascades, and the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. So they're more high elevation quail. They're also monogamous. They are a big quail. They're generally considered the largest of our quail species in North America. Average clutch sizes. But they're in the mountains, not the Rocky Mountains, but the Western Mountains, and kind of a shrubby mountain habitat. So they still like those drier conditions. Okay, those are our quail, 6 quail. Good? 5 of them out west, 1 of them here in the east. Now we're going to get into the subfamily. The subfamilies that I include on that list, there's been a lot of they've been contested a lot. Genetic analysis and recent research has taxonomists and systematists arguing a lot about how they should be taxonomically distributed. I'm going to stick with what I've got on this paper because it's pretty straightforward and easy. Okay, so these are the quail or the Odontophoridae. These are the Tetraionidae, I believe. It's been a minute. No, sorry, that's right. Yeah, the Phasianidae, the pheasant and partridge type birds. So, who's read Sand County Almanac? Good. Okay. Does anybody remember an essay entitled "Cheat Takes Over"? No.
It's been a while.
Anybody know what cheat is? Cheat is a type of grass from the Mideast, from like Pakistan, same place that the chukar partridge is from. So there were places where cheat was accidentally imported into the western grasslands, like in the Intermountain West, and outcompeted a lot of our native grasses. And there's not a lot of wildlife that does very well with cheat, but the chukar does. So the chukar was brought in as a game species that could live in those cheat systems, those altered cheat ecosystems. And it's a very popular game species in parts of the West. It's a medium-sized bird, and its distribution is centered pretty well around what we call the central basin. Or the Intermountain West, between the Rocky Mountains and the Cascades and Sierra Nevadas, in that. In that basin, right there, around Nevada, eastern, southern Oregon and Idaho, eastern Utah and Colorado, that dry Mountain West. Anybody had any experience with chukars before? We had chukars around where I studied blue grouse in Oregon, and people went hunting for them. And they said it was very addictive but very frustrating. Their dogs would chase them up these grassy mountain slopes for 1,000, 2,000 feet, just going uphill, and those birds just wouldn't sit still, and those dogs would just keep on creeping up on them. 2,000 feet up a mountain. When they got right up to the top of the mountain, they were getting ready, and the birds would fly over their heads down to the bottom again. And they said that's what hunting chukar is. And every now and then you got lucky and got one. But it's an example, kind of like rainbow trout. You put in a dam and turn a warm water stream into a cold water stream. You create an artificial condition that your native species can't do very well in. And so you put something that can do well in it. So that's kind of what we have here in an altered system. So they're a little bit bigger than the quail, 13 to 15 inches. They also form annual pair bonds. Pretty decent sized clutches. They can get pretty big. They can be R-selected when conditions are right. They like those open desert grassland slopes, that have rocky talus slopes. They eat insects and seeds. And like I say, they're from Pakistan. Anybody familiar with a Hungarian partridge or a gray partridge? Out west, hunters call them Huns. My wife and I had just been married a short amount of time, and we were driving on my study area in Oregon. Came around a corner on a cool, foggy morning, and there was a Hun in the road eating gravel, and it flew up, and I hit it. So I pulled over and went back and picked it up and brought it in the car and threw it in the cooler. And my wife's like, What are you doing with that? And I said, we're going to have it for dinner, and we did. And her family's never stopped giving me grief about that. But it's a good bird, and it has more of a northern distribution. Largely, look at where that is. What kind of habitat do you imagine a lot of that is? There's a little, it gets a little bit into the taiga, but a lot of that habitat is grassland. It's largely a grassland species. The northern Great Plains here. You get up into the Washington, Palouse, and Idaho. So there's a lot of arid grasslands. So a medium-sized chukar or grouse-like or partridge-like bird. These guys have lifetime pair bonds, whereas most are annual. Clutch sizes can be pretty variable, but decent size to pretty big clutches. Grasslands, seeds, and insects introduced from Eurasia. And like I say, we call them out west. A lot of times folks call them Hun. A lot of people enjoy hunting in those grassland systems with bird dogs. Of course, of the exotics, this is the one that everybody knows about that's most famous, right? The ringneck pheasant was introduced into the Willamette Valley of Oregon in the 1880s by a retired Army colonel who was an active, enthusiastic game bird hunter who'd been overseas. So he brought some over and he tried to release them at the E.E. Wilson Wildlife Area, which is where I lived when I was on campus at Oregon State. And they didn't make it, and he tried a few times and finally got them established. And they did very well, and they spread across a good bit of the western United States and the Midwest, and even into the northeastern United States a little bit. We tried in many southern states to stock them, including Tennessee, at a game farm the Tennessee Game and Fish Commission had back in the 1950s. And they didn't do well this far south. They do very well in more northern areas. they've done very well where we've converted a lot of our native grassland, the Great Plains, into agriculture. They've done very well in agricultural row crop habitats, wheat and corn and other grains. They've done very well. And in fact, have kind of outcompeted the greater prairie chicken, where their range overlaps with the greater prairie chicken, which doesn't do well in ag. It does well in those native grassland habitats. So this is a pretty good sized bird, 20 to 28 inches. These guys are not monogamous. They're polygynous. It's harem defense polygyny, so one male keeps a harem, defends a harem of females. Moderate clutch sizes, but they like ag lands and are pretty adaptable to ag lands or grasslands introduced, like I say, from Asia. And of course, Quail Forever, the group that a lot of you guys are familiar with, is branched out from what was originally Pheasants Forever. In the 1980s, when the Farm Bill passed the first Conservation Reserve Program, CRP land was being put on the ground down in the southeast for northern bobwhite. Up in the north, the northern Great Plains, the Dakotas, for ducks, and in the Midwest for pheasants. It was all about pheasant habitat. Pheasants are very popular. So that group, Pheasants Forever, has long been a very popular group in the Midwest. They lost their prairie chickens. Their prairie chickens, got devastated when the Great Plains, the grasslands, turned to ag. But they got this instead, and they've embraced that, so they like it. Oh, this guy is a hoot. We have a fourth non-native game bird, the Himalayan snowcock, and it has a very small range in the Ruby Mountains of Nevada, of northeastern Nevada. I'll show you the map in a second. This is a pretty decent sized partridge that lives in very high elevations, kind of alpine, subalpine, that edge of the alpine. What was the term I used for those twisted trees that grow right at the edge of the alpine? Crumb holes. Yeah, they kind of live in that marginal habitat there. So here's Nevada. There's the Ruby Mountains, and that's where they are, right there in northeastern Nevada. So it's a very small population, but it has persisted for decades now. I don't know their status now, but they get pretty decent size, 4 to 6 pounds. They're also annually monogamous. They have small to moderate clutch sizes. I think a lot of people would consider these something closer to a K-selected species relative to the rest of the upland game birds. Steep rocky slopes. They were established in the 1960s, also from Pakistan, and they have a population of just a few hundred birds, not very many. They'll never get bigger. That's just a very isolated island or patch of habitat. Here we go. Here we go. Is that not the most beautiful bird you've ever seen in your entire life? Gosh.
It's all right.
You're killing me. You're killing me dead. Just killing me dead. So if we're going to take the grouse and group them into 3 groups, let's go ahead and do it. Let's group them into forest grouse, prairie grouse, and tundra grouse. And the tundra grouse we call the ptarmigans, right? These are the blue grouse are in with the forest grouse. So the blue grouse, like I said, have been divided into dusky and sooty grouse. The sooty grouse is farther west on the coast, the Pacific Northwestern coast. The dusky grouse is inland, okay, and on up into British Columbia and Alberta, Canada. So the primary differences visually are that the western subspecies, or western species now, has this light gray terminal band, and the interior species has more of a dark gray terminal band. These patches right here on the shoulder, the informal name is shoulder spot. The formal name is a cervical apteria. An apteria is a bald place, okay, a hole, a bald spot, okay? And those are full of fat that gives them that color, and they feel full of blood, and makes them engorge. And they pull back the feathers that shows the white undersides of those feathers around. It looks like a big bullseye during the breeding season. So these are males with their breeding display to attract females. And along with that visual display, they make a sound that's called a hoot, the males hoot. So these coastal species will typically hoot 6 times, often from a tree, like a Douglas fir, and on a really still morning, you can hear it from like a mile away. And so, sounds like a bullfrog almost at a distance. These guys hoot 5 times, usually from the ground. And I've been, Jake, from me to you, watching one hoot, and I could barely hear it. So, I think a lot of that was, this was in an area that was much more open, not as many trees, and so they were more susceptible to ground to terrestrial predation. So they had to they had to lower the volume a little bit, perhaps. If they got too loud, they would get eaten. So in addition to the cervical apteria, which is also called the shoulder spot, you have a supraorbital apteria above the eye, a supraorbital apteria that's also called an eye cone. And that also engorges with blood that together, creates that visual, visually striking display that goes with the hoot to attract females. Good? So here's the ranges. The sooty, like I said, is a coastal subspecies from British Columbia all the way down into Northern California. It does occur inland in the Sierra Nevadas, and the dusky is just inland of those, all the way into the Intermountain, or to the Rocky Mountain West, in the Rocky Mountains. Good. I studied this guy right there in northeastern Oregon. That's where I was. So it's a decent sized bird. So it's bigger than a football, maybe rugby ball size, 15 to 20 inches. Polygamous, 8 to 15 eggs. They occur in conifer forests. They eat forbs, buds, and conifer needles. In the wintertime, they eat conifer needles. And in most of their range, the vast majority of their diet is the needles of Douglas fir in the wintertime. In the summer, they eat all sorts of stuff, just like other birds. They become generalists. But in the winter, it's conifer needles. In my study area, they also ate some ponderosa pine needles as well, but Douglas fir is a lot shorter needles, so easier to get down. And this brings us to our third of the forest grouse, the ruffed grouse. This is the one we have in Tennessee. It's not R-O-U-G-H, it's R-U-F-F-E-D, and that means it has a ruff. And the ruff is these feathers on the neck, these elongated black feathers on the neck that stick up. And when the male is doing its breeding display, they stick up like an umbrella all the way around its neck. That is an umbel shaped. So the scientific name is Bonasa umbellus. Umbellus refers to the umbel, the ruff. Bonasa could have a couple origins. One is it means Native Americans. Bonasa is what they called a bison, so it sounded like a thundering bison when they did their drumming, which I'll explain in a moment. Or it could be from the Latin bonasa, bone asa, which means good roast. Either one applies. But the males will find a log in the forest in the spring, and they will defend that log against other males, as you guys might remember from techniques. And in early mornings in the spring, they will beat their wings quicker and quicker. And it sounds like, some people say, an old tractor starting in the distance. So, I can't get fast enough. But it just lasts a few seconds. And like that blue grouse hooting in the coastal Northwest, on a still morning, you can hear this, half a mile away or farther. Has anybody ever heard a ruffed grouse drum? Cool. Yeah. So yeah, the center of their range, really, where their numbers are pretty high, is up around the Great Lakes in New England states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and in the winter there, they eat one thing, and what is it? Who remembers? They eat aspen catkins. Okay, the catkins of aspen trees. Down here in the southeast, in the Appalachian Mountains of East Tennessee, all the way down into North Georgia, we don't have aspens, so they eat 3 primary foods. Does anybody want to guess at any of them? What's green in the winter over there? Not rhododendron, because those leaves can be toxic, but mountain laurel. Mountain laurel's one. Another? Christmas fern, and the leaves of greenbrier, smilax. Okay, so that's the primary winter food. A lot of our grouse are generalists in the summer, and they become specialists in the winter, and that's the same for rough grouse. In that kind of center part of their range, where their numbers are really good, like Michigan, Wisconsin, they oscillate. Their populations have long-term oscillations on about a 10-year cycle. So every 10 years, their numbers are about 2 to 3 or 4 times higher than they are 5 years later. So they cycle a great deal, and there's a lot of speculation about why. A lot of people argue that they have a pretty close relationship up there with great horned owls, which predate them. So it could be that they've got something going, kind of links to the snowshoe hare, very close relationship. But we don't see those consistent oscillations down here in the southeast. Their numbers have been going down here in the southeast, probably partly because of climate impacts. Gray phase, red phase, right? What does that mean? Is that a sign of subspecies, age, sex, what? Who remembers? Nobody remembers? It's just a genetic difference, like blue eyes, brown eyes. Okay. Up there in Wisconsin, most of them are gray phase. Aspen leaves are gray. Down here in the southeast, most of them are red phase. Oak leaves tend to be reddish brown. Where I was in Oregon, that we had both, because there was a mix of different species, and so just whatever camouflage works best for them are the ones that survive. And there's that range. It's a wide range across northern North America, dips down in the mountains where increases in altitude simulate increases in latitude. It goes all the way up into Alaska. So it's a forest dwelling species, but range is very wide. 15 to 20 inches, polygamous, dozen or so eggs, aspen, popple up north, early successional mixed deciduous forests. Here in the south, where we see them in the Cherokee National Forest, is in regenerating clear cuts, about 5 or 10 years old. They don't like old forests. They like dense, young, regenerating forests where there's a lot of dense cover on the ground. Right? That's aspen catkins. That's what they're eating. Okay. Anybody ever heard of a spruce grouse? This is the fourth of our forest grouse. It's also a northern grouse and kind of similar to the blue grouse or the dusky and sooty grouse. It lives in conifer forests and eats conifer needles. Okay. It also has that superorbital acteria like the dusky and sooty grouse. Has really cool tail feathers, these retrices that have white on the ends, and they kind of go out in 3-dimensional space. And it's when you see them kind of rotating on the ground like that, it's just got a wild 3-dimensional look to it. But the males have a breeding display where they'll get up on a limb and they'll start to drop down to the ground, and partway down they'll slap their wings once and make just a loud snap, and they just call it the wing snap display, which is kind of neat. But not too many of them. They have a very far northern distribution, but they are up just below the tundra in the taiga in that northern coniferous forest. We see them in the northern New England states. We see them drop down just a little bit in the Rockies and northern Sierra Nevadas, but not many in the lower 48. We do see them more in Alaska. 14 to 23 inches, polygamous, small clutch sizes. So similar to blue grouse in a lot of their characteristics, but a more northern distribution. Okay, this takes us out of the forest grouse, those 4 species of forest grouse, into the prairie grouse. There are 3 species of ptarmigan, 4 species of prairie grouse, and 4 species of forest grouse, and 5 species of prairie grouse. Okay, so this is the first of the 5, the greater prairie chicken. The sheet that I give you points out that what's the extinct grouse? Does anybody remember? The heath hen, that's right. So that was a subspecies of greater prairie chicken. That subspecies is extinct, and there's another subspecies called the Atwater's prairie chicken. That is a subspecies of the greater prairie chicken that's endangered. Okay, that's an endangered subspecies. But the greater prairie chicken is not endangered. It's not doing anywhere near as well as it used to because of conversion of the Great Plains to agriculture, to row crops. Okay, and the ringneck pheasant, we've seen evidence that it's outcompeted it where that's happened in a lot of places. But like those forest grouse, especially the blue grouse, it has that cervical atteria. It has the supraorbital atteria, and it has these long feathers that extends above the head. Called pinnae, P-I-N-N-A-E, and they used to be called pinnated grouse because of those pinnae. But the greater prairie chicken is what we call it now. And they're famous for the males will first of all, they will all get together in one place and do their courtship behavior in the spring at the same time on one place. And what's that place called? A lek, yeah. So the prairie grouse form leks, L-E-K. They are lekking species. So it's a communal breeding ground, okay? And these areas are just established behaviorally, and they become just known as where you go hang out when you're ready to rock and roll, and it's the same place year after year. And you've heard stories of out west where these things have been for decades, maybe centuries for all we know. We've built roads right through the middle of them, and these birds are acting on fixed action patterns. You know, when their mind's on sex, they don't really care if there's a big truck driving right beside them. It's like this is my spot, and I'm not moving, and they'll look at you right there. So it's kind of fascinating. But has anybody ever seen a lek before? If you ever get a chance, it's really pretty cool. But the ones in the middle of the lek tend to be the dominant males, the older males, and the ones on the outside are the younger males. And the females have to navigate that gauntlet of young doofuses to get to the ones they're after in the middle. And the young doofuses they often call sneaker males because they're going to try to do their best to find a partner before they get to the middle. And sometimes they get lucky, sometimes they don't. So there's the current range of the greater prairie chicken. It used to be much larger, but it has shrunk with the loss of our grassland habitats, of the tall grass prairie. This is a couple populations of Atwater's prairie chicken, that endangered subspecies. A decent sized bird, 16 to 18 inches, polygamous. They are resource defense polygamous in that they're defending their spot on the lek. Now this is interesting because when we talked about big game, when you think about resource defense polygyny, what's the example? The pronghorn antelope, and they're often defending water holes, right? So these guys are defending kind of an arbitrary spot on the prairie, right? It's, who decides that this is prime real estate behavior? So it's kind of an interesting behavioral characteristic. So kind of moderate clutch sizes, northern Great Plains, a pretty wide variety of habitat. It is a game species, but a very, very limited game species today.
Similarly, the lesser prairie chicken has they're a little smaller, they're lower latitude, has that more pinkish looking cervical apteria, often the yellow eye cone. Both the greater and lesser prairie chickens do their little mating dance, their little squat and run thing that Native Americans emulate when they do the Native American dances. It's kind of fun. You were out west. Did you see any of that?
No, I wish that'd be funny.
It's pretty neat. Yeah. So they have a pretty small range, but whereas the greater prairie chicken is more on the northern Great Plains, these guys are a little farther south, and a pretty limited distribution. Whereas the greater prairie chicken is more historically the tall grass prairie, these guys tend to be more in the short grass prairie, farther west, where it's a little bit drier. The grass doesn't grow so tall. Okay. 15 to 16 inches, lek polygyny, dozen eggs, southern Great Plains, limited game. They're kind of vulnerable, not a very big distribution. Okay. I told the story in a class that some of you guys might have been in of our attempt to restore the sharp-tailed grouse to Clear Lake Ridge in southeastern Oregon in the 1990s. Northeastern Oregon, sorry, right there. We brought them from Idaho across Hell's Canyon and finally got them a small population established by creating an artificial lek. So similar species to the greater lesser prairie chickens. You see the apteria. They have a lot of similar characteristics. The tail comes to a point, long central tail feather, unlike the prairie chickens, which doesn't come to quite as much of a point. Their distribution is farther north, on up into Alaska. Now they don't tend to be a forest dweller. They're gonna find more grassland habitat throughout that northern range where they can. Their numbers haven't done great either. Average size to the others: leks, a dozen eggs, prairies, game, declining. So nothing too different there. Then we get into the largest of the grouse in North America, largest prairie grouse and largest grouse, and that's the sage grouse. Now, 20 years ago, the sage grouse was one species, but there was controversy for decades and decades, and it was finally split about 15 or 20 years ago into two species, the greater sage grouse and the Gunnison sage grouse. Neither one is doing great. The greater sage grouse is doing better, but it's declining. Habitat fragmentation, fracking, development, agriculture have all really messed up its habitat. It's a somewhat K-selected species, so its numbers have declined to the point where it's been proposed for listing as a threatened species. I don't think it's made the list yet, but it's likely to in coming years. Okay, so it's a big, fascinating looking bird. Has anybody seen videos or TV of their mating? It's kind of they fill these air pockets and kind of make a blomp, blomp, kind of a weird sound that I can't emulate very well. Watch it on YouTube or something. But their range is, how would you describe that area right there? I told you earlier with the chucker.
Central Basin.
Yeah, the Central Basin or the Intermountain West, right between the Rocky Mountains and the Cascade and Sierra Nevada mountains. Sage grouse, like a couple other species that I've said, are generalists in the summer and specialists in the winter. So is the sage grouse. They eat all sorts of stuff in the summer. In the winter, they eat the leaves of Wyoming big sage. It's a shrub. It's not very healthy, but there's a whole lot of it. So they become a specialist in the winter, and that's what they eat. Sage is not only being impacted by those things I mentioned, but fire suppression has brought in a lot of encroachment of western juniper into those sagebrush grassland systems, and juniper has shaded out a lot of the grasses and forbs that they depend on. Brayden, were you kind of in that area? Yeah. Did you ever see? You saw some? Oh, excellent. Cool. Was that pretty neat?
They're very weird looking.
They are wild. Like But they're a pretty big bird. They're a pretty good sized bird. Yeah, big game bird. Yeah. So 22 to 30 inches. Okay, we're not as big as a turkey, but we're moving in that direction. It's a pretty good sized bird. Polygynous, 6 to 13 eggs, sagebrush, declining, might be threatened one of these days. So this, even some people argue even a weirder bird, but really cool looking at thing. The Gunnison sage grouse is farther south. Okay, you're down in Utah and just maybe a little bit in southwestern Colorado, but mostly Utah. I'll show you a range map in just a minute. That's again a male displaying. These guys are all lekking species. Okay, so what you have here, the light green and dark green together is the past range of the greater sage grouse. The dark green is the current range. Okay, you got it? So this is where the greater sage grouse used to be. This is kind of where it is now, the dark green. So you see it's kind of shrunk, it's being fragmented, it's being pieced apart. The light and dark brown is the past range of the Gunnison sage grouse. The dark brown is the current range. So it's really been impacted, and it is federally endangered. It was listed pretty much as soon as they broke the species up into two different species. The Gunnison was petitioned and immediately made it. Okay, and that's, I think, part of why they were able to split it, because they recognized we're about to lose this thing. So similar, 18 to 22 inches, polygynous, small to medium clutch sizes, sagebrush habitats. Colorado and Utah, notice, you know what, I said mostly Utah, maybe a little bit Colorado. Okay, no, it's more in Colorado, isn't it? And just a little bit in Utah. I had it backwards, sorry about that. Okay. And endangered, and eats the same thing, sagebrush. Okay. How we doing? Doing okay? Everybody okay? Gosh. How can you not be fascinated by upland game birds, right? You're fascinated, right? Right? Okay. The ptarmigans are wild birds. Who's familiar with ptarmigans? Has anybody seen one before?
Videos of them, they sound really weird.
What's that?
I've seen some videos and they sound really weird.
Yeah, they're wild, yeah. We only have one species in the lower 48 states, but we have a couple others up in Alaska, so 3 species in North America. The ptarmigans are tundra or alpine dwelling species. They're adapted to very cold conditions. Notice the feathered legs, the feathered feet, and the feathered toes. Okay. Not only are their toes feathered, they have little appendages called pectinations that grow out on either side of their toes during the wintertime that give them more surface area and increase their ability to walk on top of the snow, kind of like snowshoes, which is kind of rude. They have, as you can tell, a winter plumage that gives them camouflage and a lot of thermal protection from the cold climates that they live in. So the first is the rock ptarmigan, and notice that this is northern Canada, above the taiga in the tundra, all the way up into the Arctic region of Alaska, the far northern Canadian provinces, right? 12 to 16 inches. These are annually monogamous for the most part. Average clutch sizes. They eat forbs. It is a game species, but most people don't go after them unless they live up there, because there's not that many. The willow ptarmigan is another northern species that we don't have down here in the lower 48 states. We have it up in Alaska. Would you describe that one on the left and the top? At least its neck is kind of reddish colored. Have you ever heard of grouse hunting in Scotland or Great Britain? Okay, what they're after there is the red grouse, and this is the same species. This is the red grouse. Has anybody ever heard of a whiskey called Famous Grouse Whiskey? This is it. This is what it's named after, the red grouse of Scotland, the willow ptarmigan. The same thing, okay? Notice it has a black tail, okay, in the wintertime, and that's about it, a black beak and eyes and tail. Again, a very far northern distribution of northern Canada and Alaska. Kind of similar to the others, annual monogamy, average size and clutch size, open tundra. I just said all that stuff, didn't I? It's similar to the rock ptarmigan, but it's a little bit bigger and it has that black tail. So unless they're side by side, it's hard to tell which is bigger, but the black tail is diagnostic. And okay, this is interesting, it does not use alpine habitats. So whereas the rock ptarmigan gets up into alpine in Alaska, these guys are just a tundra species, okay, lower flat. And then the third is the white-tailed ptarmigan that we have a little bit in the lower 48 states, not just a whole lot. Notice that male coming into breeding time with that supraorbital apteria. The tail is white on the top side, and in the summertime, that tail stays white. And that's what it's referring to, is the summer plumage. It still has the white tail. Okay, so it has a much smaller distribution. You see this range map, it shows it dipping down into the northern Cascades of Washington State and the Rocky Mountains of Montana and Idaho. But it's pretty doggone rare. It's in the alpine areas at very high elevations, and it's pretty rare. You also see a small population in Colorado in the Rocky Mountains, so the Rocky Mountain National Park. And I've seen a couple there. And then like that road that goes up to like 10, 12,000 feet elevation in Rocky Mountain National Park. You can get around, wander up there and see them every now and then. Not scads, but small populations. Has anybody seen any of those before? Anybody been to the Rocky Mountains? If you ever get a chance at high elevations, you might can see them. It's pretty cool. Not huge, 11 to 12 inches, annual monogamy, small clutch sizes, 2 to 8. Alpine, marginal subalpine, they like snow, and they are a game species where they're plentiful. Home stretch, okay. Logan's like, finally. All right, so Logan, you might as well learn Meleagris gallopavo. I mean, come on. It's 8 syllables. Meleagris gallopavo, Bonesa umbellus, Calinus virginiana. You actually learn those 3 scientific names. I'm not going to make you, but it would be really cool. Okay, so the wild turkey, Meleagris gallopavo, has 5 subspecies, okay? The most eastern one, with the largest distribution, is the eastern, top left, Meleagris gallopavo sylvestris, okay? This is Eugene Sylvester. Actually, there's a range map. You have the Merriams, the Rio, the Florida, which is far south in Florida, about to get hit by another hurricane, and then the deep south, Mexico, and just barely comes up into southern New Mexico and Arizona, the Goulds, which is not a game species in the United States, but it is in Mexico. Okay, there aren't enough of them here in the United States. So let's look at a range map. This blue is the Sylvestris, is the eastern, okay? The orange is the Florida wild turkey, and the scientific name of that subspecies is Osceola, is Meleagris gallopavo osceola. Now listen, well, here you go. I said in a few minutes I'm going to show you. There it is. This is not a wild turkey. This is a different species down in Central America called the ocellated turkey, okay? Now the ocellated turkey sounds a little bit like the Osceola turkey, but it's different. The Osceola turkey is Meleagris gallopavo osceola, is the Florida subspecies. The ocellated turkey is this guy down in southern Central America. Got it? It's a beautiful bird, and some people do go hunt it, but they're not our species, not what we got. So you got the Florida turkey, the eastern, right? Green is the Rio Grande, and it goes in the Midwest all the way down into southern Texas and Mexico, okay? Red is farther south in the Intermountain West, right? That is the Merriams. And the Goulds is this tan in Mexico and barely gets into Arizona and New Mexico. And it's a little bit harder now as they work on that wall. It's barely here, and you'll probably never have a lot of it. Although, who knows, maybe climate change will create more favorable conditions for it. Maybe we'll get more of it.
Don't start.
I was looking at what I said. So this is, of course, the turkey. The wild turkey is the largest of our upland game birds, 43 and 45 inches. They're polygynous. They have, similar clutch sizes to all of these others. Their habitat ranges widely, depending on what subspecies and where you are. They occur across a good bit of North America. Let me go to this map. Notice up here, what's up with that? What's up with all that mess up here?
Well, eastern way up there.
Introductions, all sorts of introductions going on up here. Okay, that's what all that's about. So they're all sorts of stuff. Oh yeah, and that's the range of the ocellated turkey right down there. Okay, so the eastern wild turkey. Back in the 1970s, when I was a kid, we didn't have wild turkeys in Tennessee. I saw my first one at Land Between the Lakes when I was 11 years old deer hunting. For decades, during the 50s and 60s and 70s, the prevailing thought in the profession was that turkeys are forest-dwelling species, and we got rid of most of our forests, and they're not going to do well in these fragmented habitat that we have left. But then, people started arguing, wait a second, they do fine out west, and we didn't always have forests. We had savannas and some prairies here. Why can't we have turkeys? So we started, and we looked and saw in Alabama, there was a bunch of them. Alabama in the 1970s still had a bunch. I'll show you that soon. So we started trying to trap them and move them to different places. And it was slow going. Back when we were first trying to trap turkeys, we were using these like log cabin style traps and catching them one at a time, and it was really slow. We finally figured out cannon nets in the 1980s, and that allowed us to start catching flocks of turkeys. And we started moving them a lot. And Tennessee was getting them Middle Tennessee was getting them from Missouri and Land Between the Lakes. And West Tennessee was getting them from Alabama, coming up through Anderson-Tully Wildlife Management Area. And through the 80s and 90s up to the year 2000, Tennessee trapped and moved around 10,000 turkeys, and we got them in every county. So it's been a real success story. They've done very well. And it turns out they do very well in the mixed habitats we have. There's been a lot of debate about why here's what we had. In the 1970s, where we still had turkeys was in East Tennessee. Okay, we had mountains, we had forests, we had a lot of land that wasn't disturbed, we didn't have as many people. But when we started putting turkeys back on the ground, those populations in East Tennessee they didn't change much. They didn't increase that much. Middle Tennessee exploded. West Tennessee came up more slowly. We never had as many as Middle Tennessee. And there's a lot of speculation and debate about why did that happen? Why did East Tennessee, they always had them, but they never increased. Middle Tennessee, they did fantastic. West Tennessee, they did okay, but not as good. Any thoughts?
Nesting habitat,
So what do you mean?
like wetlands over here, when these birds would be laying eggs, they would be getting, like, in the bottomlands, they didn't have brood nesting areas.
Yeah, so our good nesting habitat in West Tennessee, our good forested habitat, was mostly down whatever was left in the annual floodplain. So they're getting flooded out a lot in the springtime. Okay. Why do you think East Tennessee, first of all, why was it the only area that still had birds by the 1970s? I kind of alluded to it already. Less farms, fewer people, more back inaccessible land. So, we didn't hunt them all out, okay? And why did their numbers not really increase that much when we started trying to propagate them?
No connectivity of what?
Like it's already kind of fragmented-ish, maybe they just couldn't like really connect back to new populations. I don't know, I'm guessing.
Good try, but no. It was primarily forested habitat, and there wasn't any early successional habitat. And so, I mean, there was good winter, mast and stuff, but they kind of like a quail, kind of like a mix. They like some forest, but they like some early successional fields where they can find a lot of invertebrates and dense cover on the ground for nesting, and there just wasn't much of that. So it didn't have the diversity of habitat that the rest of the state had. And what did Middle Tennessee have? We had very interspersed habitat, a mixture of forest and grassland. We didn't have as many row crops as West Tennessee. We had a lot more cattle pastures. The turkeys, they wasn't great for them, but they could do better than quail could in a fescue pasture, and they just responded phenomenally to it. So turkeys have done really well.
If you go out to the west, the Merriam's turkey, my roommate in Oregon was studying Merriam's turkeys, and they were studying them in Arizona, I think, New Mexico, finding pretty low numbers, and the limiting factor was roosts. All the turkeys were roosting on telephone poles because it was desert. It was the only thing around they could roost on, and probably the presence of telephone poles increased their carrying capacity dramatically. Yeah, so that's pretty. You survived. Good. Okay. Do you feel